Our next guest, Professor Patrick Schmotmer. He teaches an entire course at Seattle University about the hows and whys civilizations fail. He's going to share some insights. All right, Patrick, let's start the interview now. We'll go on the record.
All right.
What is your name and what do you do?
My name is Patrick Shetmer. I'm a political scientist, a teacher, a researcher, and such at Seattle University in Seattle, Washington.
Seattle must be a center for the intelligentsia because we interviewed someone from Seattle just a few days ago.
Oh, yeah?
Dr. Patrick Ward, or Peter Ward, from the University of Washington at Seattle on climate change. So,
yeah. There's actually another. Yeah, I'm familiar with them. I'm blanking on their names, but there's another couple people at University of Washington who work on things in this whole area. So I guess maybe Seattle attracts people who are interested in this topic.
Ah, and that topic being what?
Well, dramatic change and social collapse, perhaps.
Okay.
There are a couple of faculty up at the University of Washington who study deception and stuff like that. They have a whole course called On Bullshit, which is an interesting little course.
What was the name of the course again?
On Bullshit.
All right. I'd sign up for that for sure. And you've been referred to us by Paul Jupe, who's a professor at Denison University.
Right.
And he said that you were right up our alley because you teach a course in the collapse of civilizations and even on a broader perspective, the collapse of perhaps mankind or humankind.
Well, yeah, I teach a course called The Politics of the End, and it essentially is about social collapse and the role of government in either forestalling, mitigating, or aiding and abetting said collapses. Government plays a central role in whether or not a society is going to be able to pull through a potential collapse scenario or not. And so I think it's an interesting topic to bring to the students, and I also think it's a topic we need more people talking about in general.
Well, you're serving that purpose now. I can guarantee you'll have an audience of about at least 1,000. So, and we're working on getting the word out more. And by the way, thanks to Paul Jupe, his episode really gave us a boost. So shout out to him. All right, so Patrick, you've got the course is about how governance might deal with a collapse. That assumes that there is a collapse.
Right. Well, any sort of system is going to have pretty much at any time threats to it that could, in theory, destabilize it. Mm-hmm. So whether or not a society and the government that represents that society is going to be able to resist those pressures to collapse, that entropic force, is really a factor of the government's robustness and really the belief that people have in the government to provide the responses they need to maintain the status quo or to maintain stability.
Is that belief factor, the society's, the population's belief that the government can handle it, is that an important factor?
Absolutely. One video clip I like to use in class that kind of hits at this point is from a show called The Game of Thrones. It's an exchange between the spy master character and a guy who's like the advisor to the king named Tyrion, and they're talking about politics and power, and he talks about essentially how all politics, all power is in a sense an illusion. People have power, governments have power as long as people believe that they have power and people believe in them. And when the government loses the confidence of the people, when people withdraw from the state and refuse to support it, that's when collapse really begins.
hate to be redundant, but Peter Ward at there in Seattle said that about gods last week. That
Mhm.
a God exists only so long as there are people that believe in him or her. Um, I guess there might be a parallel to governance. Um, all right, so belief is important that the government can handle the shit that's about to hit the fan or that is currently hitting the fan. And
Mhm.
and what you're talking about stress on a society, on a civilization, um, as a factor. What kind of things arise that put stress on a civilization or a society?
Well, that's actually a pretty lively point of debate, and most people have their own pet theories about what the greatest dangers are. Like Jared Diamond, who's a well-known geographer and so forth, he often points to environmental threats as being
Curse his name,
the most.
Patrick. Curse his name. For the audience sake, I spoke with Patrick to set up the interview, and I mentioned the fact that Jared Diamond didn't even return our calls. Evil. So, all right. Now, Jared Diamond.
I'm a firm believer that academics have an obligation to provide information to anyone who wants to seek it out.
And our greatest source of information has been the academics in this series, and hats off to them, providing their time, not just to their students and how they get paid, but to help educate. And dude, your issue's fucking crucial. Getting the word out is it's a good thing to do. It's a good thing to do for the university, but society needs it. All right. So, anyways, back to Jared Diamond. Kudos, though, dude.
So Jared Diamond, in the end, thinks that environmental threats are the ones that tend to most threaten societies. His argument, the idea being, is that societies are built on an arrangement between the society and the land it lives on, and when the environment shifts, that arrangement breaks down, and the way that the community used to be able to survive is no longer viable. So they have to go out and search for new ways to survive, or the society falls apart. But there are a lot of other theories that people put forward as well.
Well, can I talk about that one before? Could I just ask a question about that?
Sure.
He has a famous line in his book and in some of his lectures about what was going through the mind of the man when he cuts down the last palm tree on Easter Island. The deforestation being a problem, the environment, man destroys his environment, but that's less to do with governance as opposed to what's in the mind of the person cutting down that final tree. Certainly it wasn't his first tree that he cut down, but, as the last tree went down. Go ahead.
But any society that exists is going to have some form of governance.
Mm-hmm.
And Darren Ajimolu and David Robinson, they have a book where they write about the collapse of nations, and their whole argument is about how government and the economy work in a relationship. Mm-hmm. And the economy works when the government is in harmony and the economy is in harmony with each other. So that last man could only cut down the last tree if he was operating in a political system that allowed him to indiscriminately cut down. As Diamond himself talked about in the book Collapse, there were other Polynesian communities where they didn't completely deforest, and the reason they didn't completely deforest is because the government instituted a strict quota system. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to natural resources, if the government doesn't take an active role in managing and husbanding the resources, then more rapacious or elements of society that aren't necessarily thinking in the long term but are thinking more in the short term, mm-hmm. Can do damage that can significantly weaken or undermine that society. And so that's part of what we're talking about when we talk about institutional capacity. If people won't support the government or won't let the government manage or do what it needs to do to think about long-term survival of the community, then the government will be helpless to prevent these sorts of tragedies.
All right, whether it be an environmental threat or any other stresses.
Yeah, any other stresses. I mean, external, internal stresses. I mean, no collapse has a single source.
Mm-hmm.
They're usually a accumulation of different factors. If we go back to the classic example in Western society of Rome, certainly had
reading my mind.
shifting climate, but it also had internal stressors as people were fighting over spoils, and external stressors as the Germans began to press more and more on the Roman borders in Central Europe.
Mm-hmm.
So it isn't just one thing, but it usually is. There usually is a trigger that leads to a cascade effect.
Okay. Yeah, I'm reading a book now that, and I've never heard this one before, but Fall of Rome was caused by, according to this book, the rise of an oligarchy. And
right.
So.
Well, in the book by Bruce Bueno de Mesquita and something Smith, I'm forgetting his co-author's first name, called the Dictator's Handbook, they talk a lot about how governments are ultimately accountable to the people who hold them in power. Mm-hmm. And so a government that thinks about the public at large is only a rational government if those are the people who are in charge of putting them in power. If a government does what's good for the people, but it's, say, a military junta that's keeping them in power, that government is going to lose power pretty quickly and be replaced by someone else. So as a government transitions from, say, a democracy to an oligarchy, then a government is going to cater more to the way that those few people at the top maintain their wealth rather than the well-being of the people overall, which is going to create instability and resentment and rebellion and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Kind of self-defeating.
And that's what you had internal pressures.
Mm-hmm. Now, with respect to the United States, you say there's many reasons why a civilization, or in the case of the United States, an empire, there's many stresses that the United States might or is currently facing. Is it a long list?
I mean, any nation state as complex as the U.S. is going to run into a long list of issues that it's going to have to deal with.
That's good for me because that means I have a lot of episodes I can do.
Yeah, you have a lot of material to cover. For a place like the United States, you're going to have, in a real sense, have a lot of the same stories that you're going to have looking at Rome. Mm-hmm. Over the next 40, 50, 100 years, we're going to probably see a fairly dramatic shift in climate. Mm-hmm. That will winners and losers, and anytime you produce losers, you produce a element in society that will want to go back to a prior time when they weren't necessarily the losers of society. Mm-hmm. That sort of tension is one that you'd have to wrestle with.
Could you give an example of how that manifests itself today?
Sure. If we look at the Midwest, for example, in the 1940s and the 1950s and the 1960s, industrial manufacturing was at the heart of the American economy. Mm-hmm. Detroit was the fourth largest city in the country. And starting in the 70s, we began to see a transformation in the economy. And in around the 70s, we began to see a decline and then a collapse of Detroit itself. And the people who were injured by the change in the economy, the working class, blue-collar, generally white individuals in the Midwest, began to, and especially among the men, began to transform politically from being contented supporters of the status quo to angry and discontent individuals seeking some sort of increasingly radical change to try to stymie off the worst of the current situation or to prevent an even more catastrophic potential collapse later. That would just be one example of how, in this case, an economic transformation can create or transform a political force and create a new constituency around which a politic could be built.
One political scientist we interviewed called it the Southernization of the Midwest. And
as much as the Midwest was always a manufacturing and industrial heartland, and as those manufacturing jobs go away, that it might resemble the South more, I could see that argument.
Mm-hmm. And now you've got an unsatisfied population in the Midwest, continuing on with that example. And how would they rebel in a democracy?
How would they rebel in a democracy?
Mm-hmm.
Well, there are a couple of different ways to do it. First of all, you can increasingly refuse to go along with the government.
Mm-hmm.
You can resist it openly, although as long as the government enjoys broad support, that's not going to generally be successful in the long run. But you can turn to increasingly radical political elements and lend them your support in order to try to, again, stave off a potential worst-case scenario from your point of view.
Okay.
So if you want to use the case of Germany, the economic doldrums of Germany in the 1920s led the working class there to become increasingly radical, and you saw a loss in support for centrist parties and an increase in support for both fascists and communists. When people get desperate, they're willing to try desperate solutions.
All right. And desperate solutions. We interviewed a woman from a cultural science professor out of Australia.
Mm-hmm.
And she published a book recently about why these people, for example, would vote against their own self-interest. For example, the people of the Midwest.
Mm-hmm.
The stress, the dissatisfaction, could that cause them to vote against their own self-interest?
Well, I mean, in a sense it could, but the main mechanism here, one reason why they might shift from, say, supporting a economic policy that is targeted towards them and shift towards more focusing on social policy could be that they don't trust the party that's promising the economic goods. They don't think that they can or will deliver anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So one group might vote against, take actions that might appear to be voting against their economic interests. They might do it because they're comfortable economically and they're, moved up that hierarchy of needs that Maslow outlined for us and are wanting to focus on more higher order issues. Or it could be that they still really care about those economic issues, but they don't trust the people to deliver them anymore, and they're looking for somebody else who can bring home the goods instead.
All right. Now, remembering Paul Jupe and his forte, and that is the influence of religion on the way people vote. Could that impact, say, an area like the Midwest in times of stress?
You mean people's religious values and how they vote?
I'm thinking more along the lines of self-destruction. Say a a fundamentalist who is looking forward to the apocalypse, and could that influence his vote or their vote? That let's bring about the apocalypse. Let's really fuck things up.
Well, I would say that that's more a product of their loss of belief in the government rather than a affirmative aspect of their belief in their faith.
Mm-hmm.
When we see religious values and political values come into conflict in general,
Mm-hmm.
people usually will privilege their political values over their religious values, and they'll move to make their religion match their politics rather than make their politics to match their religion. So if we see people embracing more apocalyptic sorts of religious imagery, it's much more likely that they're looking for something to justify or to support something that they already want to do politically, rather than it being the religious force pushing them in that direction initially. Now, every sort of individual is going to be a little bit different, and there are going to be people who privilege their religious identity over any other sort of political identity. You're going to have, Aum Shinrikyo type people from Japan who really do strive to create sort of an apocalyptic vision. But that's more an exception than the rule, I think, when it comes to the interaction between religions and states and political stability. Religion, from a crude and from a utilitarian perspective, is a tool, and it can be used either to promote stability or to further erode it. And that's entirely at the hands of the people who are at the leadership positions in these religious institutions and how they want to use the gift that they've been given, I guess you could say, or how they want to focus the tool. The religion doesn't necessarily itself push you one way or the other.
All right. Then let me ask, as part of the series we're doing, we went to a Trump rally. And we weren't allowed to take our cameras in, but we were able to interview people outside, and we talked to a number of people, and it became apparent after the first or second, third interview that the conversations were littered with praise Jesus, thank God Almighty, that kind of thing. And it wasn't like it was 51%. It was most everybody,
right,
had some sort of connection, to the point where one fellow, and literally scared the shit out of me. He said, with his friends there, he said, we believe that Donald Trump was sent by God into the mother's womb, where he was then he was given birth, and at that time anointed by God to save the United States from itself. And I swear, Patrick, at that point in the interview, my legs started to tremble. Not figuratively speaking, but physically started to tremble. Now, certainly these guys... Well, go ahead.
I was saying, who adopt imagery like that pretty much every election. If we went back to the 2012 election, for example, a lot of Mormons would reference something called the White Horse Prophecy, which foretold a time when the Constitution would be in danger, and then a great Mormon leader would rise to save the American Constitution, because the Mormons themselves view the Constitution as a divine document. So there's very often in every election people pointing to their preferred candidate and proclaiming them anointed by God.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wonder which comes first. Going back to Rome and or even ancient Egypt, where the emperors, or the whatever they're called, or geez, even in medieval Europe, wasn't the bloodline supposed to be some sort of holy writ? Um, it does. I just never thought of this before, but it does seem like a common thread that the political leaders try to adapt or get the public to believe that they were sent by God. Huh.
Yeah, religion has a powerful way to provide legitimacy, and anyone who wants to create a certain degree of stability will try to absorb or embrace some of that legitimizing light that religion can provide. In that way, religion can be a stabilizing force. If you can use other people's faith to say, this person is credible, this person is good, the big guy upstairs vouches for him, that can help to soothe tensions or nervousness that might otherwise arise in a period of transformation or a period of challenge. A little something within is what they say religion has that other sorts of institutions don't. It's the idea that religion can provide you some sort of divine protection or divine assurance. And so while the religiousness might not necessarily impel you towards one candidate or another, if you can then infuse your support for that candidate with religious motifs or to draw it into your faith in some way, that can give you an extra degree of confidence to take action that you might not otherwise have.
Interesting. So it's, if I could put a button on that, it would, has that religious influence ever succeeded in sustaining an empire? Is there an example of an empire that is still around that had that mentality? It was a rhetorical question.
Right. Well, historically, lots of Western empires have used religion as sort of the glue to hold things together, especially in multicultural, multi-ethnic empires.
Mm-hmm.
Rome wound up using Christianity. The Caliphate used Islam. And the American empire is very much built on a sort of civil religion, as Robert Bellah would put it, where in the famous words of President Eisenhower, you didn't necessarily you didn't have to believe in anything particular. You just have to believe in something. So religion is often used as a glue in multicultural societies where you don't necessarily have those kinship ties or those blood ties to help say we are one. So a faith in something bigger than the rest of us is often used to create that bind instead.
Mm-hmm. That have you ever heard of Paul Weyrich or Weyrich?
Mm-hmm.
Genius or Satan?
Genius or Satan? I don't know. I don't know about that.
Well, he found a way to harness religion and sort of bring it under the Republican Party's umbrella. Certainly a dependable tentpole for the Republican Party. I wonder if that's sustainable or not. Somehow, I think of religion as a poison pill that, or a mine in a mine that you could step on.
I would say that the increasing identification with religion and the Republican Party in particular is a big part of the story about why religion is seen as such a tense force today. In a very real sense, we're doing today what the Europeans did 100-some years ago.
Mm-hmm.
As you saw democracy rising up in Europe, the Catholic Church in particular, but other religious institutions began to support Christian democratic parties in order to have a force acting on their behalf or their interest. But over time, those parties had to move away from the influence of the church, which wound up weakening the church. And at the same time, by affiliating with one party, they encouraged the rival parties to withdraw from religious institutions because those religious institutions became challengers to their own political support. So while bringing in faithfulness to the Republican Party in the short term, I think certainly paid political dividends. In the long term, its main effect is going to be erode religiosity in the United States overall. And when you look at the interaction of religion and politics in the United States today, you find when people move towards the Republican Party, even if they weren't very religious before, they tend to behave a little bit more religiously afterwards. And after people go from not being a Democrat to a Democrat, they tend to behave somewhat less religious. So in a sense, religion is becoming polarized, just like all these other sorts of issues.
All right.
So again, I think that religion here is more tapping into a political divide rather than being the political divide itself.
Well, that makes me recall the cautionary words of George Washington when he stepped down from the presidency, that political parties should never form because it will be the end of the country. I know I botched that quote, but I think
right. Well, Washington said that, but he also became at least a reluctant Federalist himself. So parties may be and partisanship may be unpleasant at times, but democracy can't really seem to function very well without them.
Have you ever seen that? Go ahead. I was going to ask you, have you ever seen that TV show where they kick people off the island?
Like Survivor?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, where they kind of form political parties,
right?
Groups and factions in order to survive.
Right.
So, but it usually ends up, I think the whole purpose of the show is one person survives, everyone else is gone.
Right.
Maybe it's that last lumberjack on Easter Island. I don't know. But,
yeah. Well, I mean, any sort of party arrangement is always temporary. Eventually, the reason people start working together fades. It no longer becomes important. And then other issues arise, and that pulls you in different directions. It's true in your personal life. You have friends you grow closer to over time. You have friends you move away from as your interests diverge, change. Same is true for groups and political coalitions. You come together because you all see a need to overcome the depression, and you need to make sure you can all feed your kids. But later on, you come apart because you disagree on whether or not Jim Crow is a good idea, for example, if we want to look at partisan shifts over the last 50, 60 years.
That's pretty optimistic.
So a lot of the...
I say that's pretty optimistic.
Well, I think it's been the trend, and you know, sometimes partisan collapses or partisan transformations are very ugly. We had essentially a very uneasy truce for most of the 19th century. We saw a realignment in party interests in 1860 as Northerners started to move behind Lincoln and his tepid abolitionism, and it turned into a civil war. So the shifting, any time that we see a shifting in these coalitions is always going to be a somewhat unsteady time. If we look at 1896, when lots of political scientists argue we saw a coalition transformation. That was a period where we had lots of bombings from anarchists and assassinations and so forth. 1932 with Roosevelt. Newspapers were calling for Roosevelt to abandon constitutional democracy. They said you should emulate those, you know, plucky upstarts, Hitler and Mussolini, and move in that direction. He resisted it, but again, it was a very tense time. 1968, again, a really tense time where society felt like it was kind of falling apart. This is part of the natural cycle of a democracy to some extent, and being able to manage these tense times as things reconfigure themselves is an important part of maintaining the status quo. And if you botch it, if you put in the wrong guy, then things could fall apart again.
Now,
just like worst case scenario, just like they did in 1860, where a bunch of people decided to take their ball and go home.
all right. Now, there's definitely a geographic trend to the polarization, the system in the United States. Does that lend itself to 1865, and or like the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia, a velvet, what was it? A velvet divorce.
Well,
certainly a velvet divorce is preferable to 1865 and the Civil War.
Right. Civil, yes. An amicable departure is preferable to a violent departure. But I think in part it depends on the identities of the people involved and the interconnectedness of the economy. Even on a smaller scale, you constantly have people in, say, California trying to secede and form new states, or up here in Washington. You constantly have people trying to secede and make new states. Mostly they don't go anywhere because most people recognize that even if you don't necessarily like the politics of the people in Seattle or in the Bay Area, that the money that these areas are bringing in to a very real extent are underlying the lifestyles that people have in the more rural areas. And so as long as there is, value in that relationship, people are going to find a way to get along well enough. The real difference between 1860 and these other challenges is that the Southerners felt that the abolition of slavery would completely destroy their economy. So in the end, they were, again, making an economic wager that a messy divorce would hurt them less than a uneasy continuance of a relationship that they felt would ultimately undermine their economy.
Now that train of thought was held by the oligarchs or the man in...
Well, I think it was, in a sense, held by pretty much everyone in the South. Even if you didn't own slaves, your income was at least indirectly connected to slavery, whether you're building houses for cities where slavery makes up an important part of the economy, or you're working in shipping and receiving and you're selling cotton abroad. You may not own any slaves yourself, but you're certainly selling the proceeds of slavery. And in the minds of many, working class or everyday Southerners, owning a slave was sort of an aspirational goal. To have a house slave to help your wife with the daily chores was seen as a sign that you'd made it in Southern society. So even if you didn't own slaves yourself, you still saw a value economically as well as culturally and socially in slavery.
Or this is when I ask you this question, you're going to tell, I'm going to really bring it home that I'm a glass half empty guy. That average man in the street in the South, I don't know, I submit, well, let me ask you, you're the expert. Was it his goal to own a slave, or was it to keep that slave from fucking his wife?
A little bit of A, a little bit of B, I'd say. White supremacy was definitely an important part of the Southern story, and if you look at the secession documents put out by the states as they left the Union, maintaining white supremacy was a central goal. So that was certainly part of the equation as well. I mean, you didn't want anyone else sleeping with your wife, but you certainly didn't want an African American slave sleeping with your wife.
Yeah.
But you still had those resentments in the North as well, and you didn't have slavery. True. And you had a broad support for abolition. So there had to be more than just that fear or resentment of African Americans to explain the differing attitudes in the South and the North, and those economic ties really explain it. Another reason why Northerners were resentful of slavery is because they felt it undermined their own wages. That people could bring in slaves to help build, say, the Capitol in D.C. And after the Dred Scott decision, in theory, you could buy a slave in the South and then take them anywhere in the country. Mm-hmm. So slavery was increasingly an economic threat to the Northerners, as well as the abolition of slavery being an economic threat to the Southerners.
All right, so we're talking about stresses on a society.
Mm-hmm.
I guess we could include racism as a potential stress.
Oh yeah, and when it comes to stressors, communal or ethnic or religious violence in a community is one of the most common ways that we see states fail or governments collapse or societies collapse. Seeing your us as a smaller subset of the overall society, if you feel our us is threatened, you can withdraw from society and seek your own path. Mm-hmm. And when things turn violent in those kinds of scenarios, then government quickly loses the ability to enforce its laws and carry out its responsibilities in those areas where violence is breaking out.
All right.
And so again, that's one of the historical reasons why civil religion in the U.S. was so important, because we did have these ethnic divisions as well as racial divisions in the country. Excuse me, being blandly Christian or Judeo-Christian was sort of a way to kind of paper over some of these ethnic or racial differences in the country. Or at least create enough agreement that you can go by and interact when you had to with people from the other groups.
All right. So oligarchy being a stress, or plutocracy or aristocracy.
Well, the way we would put it in particular in the literature when we're talking about it is state predation.
Is what?
State predation, when the state shifts from providing goods and services to the community to preying or extracting resources in them for a upper echelon of individuals. So when the state, so that's another real cause or threat that can cause a societal collapse as well. And that's sort of what you were referencing earlier when we talked about oligarchy in Rome. That the state stopped being for the people and started being for this small group, and stopped seeing the people as their charges and more as a resource to be exploited.
Machiavelli referred to that aspect as usurping. I don't speak Italian, but the Italian word based in Latin means to rape.
Right.
When the oligarchs are raping as opposed to helping. And all right, now, in a democracy, we're all over the board here now. Back to oligarchy. In a democracy, how does the population get away from an oligarchy?
Well, most often it's a period of crisis that causes a certain flattening of society. If we look at, say, the 1920s, the last time we had a high degree of economic inequality, a proto-oligarchy emerging, ultimately what overcame that was economic collapse. Mm-hmm. The economy cratered, everyone got hit, and then people were willing to try something a little more desperate, in this case, the New Deal. That coupled with the shift to a total war economy significantly reduced economic inequality.
The New Deal, it required one of the oligarchs to break free from the herd, the oligarchical herd. Um,
hmm
is there anyone like that, or do we need the crisis first? Do we need the soup lines, and then
Uh,
maybe an oligarch says, "Hey, I'm going to help. I'm going to be helpful, generous."
well, I mean, even if you go back to Germany in the 1890s in the Second Reich, um, Germany created the first welfare state. And they created the first welfare state not because the Kaiser was a benevolent ruler, but because there was a crisis and they were worried about people rising up and rebelling against them.
Mm-hmm.
So they saw the welfare state as an alternative to a communist revolt. In a very real sense, people have to become desperate enough before, or you have to sense that they're willing to go further than they normally would before you can win these big concessions. A big reason why Obama was able to get through the Affordable Care Act in 2009, 2010, for example, and Clinton failed in 93, 94 with his health care was that the need for some sort of action on health care seemed a lot more pressing, particularly with people losing their jobs right and left during the Great Recession. So action was spurred by this sense of threat or this sense of doom people were willing to accept more radical action.
Now, you're talking about a period. Clinton was first, or Hillary Clinton was trying for that health care back. What was the year of that?
Clinton care, they pushed for that in 93 and 94.
And Obama got health care through in 2009, 2010, somewhere around there?
Yes. Yeah, it was mostly at most of 2009, and then, you had the maneuvering that had to take place after the death of Ted Kennedy and the loss of the supermajority in the Senate. But yeah, it's mostly 2009 and bleeds into a little bit into 2010.
So almost 20 years, 2 decades for that
right.
that change.
Right.
For the radical idea that healthcare should be something everyone has access to.
Well, Roosevelt actually proposed it as part of the New Deal. It didn't go through then. So the Democrats have been working at it a lot longer than that.
Oh, didn't Nixon have a health care in mind at one point?
Yeah, he did. And
that Mormon from Massachusetts, what was his name?
I'm sorry?
The Mormon?
Mitt Romney?
From Mitt Romney? Yeah.
Mitt Romney?
He's a Republican. Every now and then you got a hiccup. Now let's get into the weeds. What is so abhorrent about health care that the Republicans just can't fucking stand it?
For health care? Well, I think it's more that they don't mind health care, it's that they don't like the taxes that go with it. But I think that's more connected to their ideology than anything else.
The cost of it.
Manage to do it free.
They just added $2 trillion to the debt. They didn't mind that cost.
Well, that's because that cost benefited, an important part of their party. Both parties, in a sense, are out to service the needs of their constituency, and the tax cut benefited their constituency. And
now,
health
wait
insurance
a second,
might.
Patrick. I have to interrupt. I apologize. It's rude, but the Republican constituency. I can't even say it.
Constituency.
Yeah. So you're talking about fundamentalists, racists, and dissatisfied Midwesterners. How does keeping them from getting health care help their constituency? I said it.
It doesn't. The parties are made up of lots of different factions, and every arrangement comes with a little give and take. Mm-hmm. And if you wanted, to use your word, oligarchical parts of the party to support the policy that the that others have decided they want most importantly, which would be building a wall. They wanted their own concessions to come as well, and what they wanted was reductions in their tax burden.
Okay.
So it was prioritizing the different demands among the factions of their party, and they chose to prioritize the preferences of this wealthy elite first, and then work on other priorities later. Because both the healthcare attempt to repeal the Affordable Care Act and the tax policy were ultimately about reducing tax burden. If you go back and review the debates, in both cases, that's what the focus was about. And while the idea is that their poor and middle class supporters might benefit a little bit from a tax reduction, that there would be more benefit the further up the scale you went.
All right, can I go down one more rabbit hole with you before we conclude? Do you have just
Sure.
another minute or so?
Sure.
All right.
I just have grading after this anyway, so.
Hey, it's inflation, dude. Political science. Everybody gets an A. I went to film school, so it was just standard. Yeah. All right. Does propaganda heighten the stress, or is it in itself a stress? What role does propaganda play?
Well, lots of civil collapses are precipitated, or in particular civil wars are precipitated by people not accurately estimating the costs and benefits of a conflict. When people come to have unsupportably optimistic views of the benefits of a conflict, or downplay potential costs of a conflict, then conflict becomes more likely. Mm-hmm. And misinformation can do a good job in hyping the upside and downplaying the downside, which makes people more enthusiastic for a conflict. And as conflict begins, as we mentioned earlier, it can then spiral and spread, and you can have sort of a domino effect where a small conflict can grow into a raging fire. Okay. So misinformation can be an important tool for political entrepreneurs, I guess you can say, people who see a personal benefit in creating conflict, in stoking it and making people much more receptive to the idea of pursuing potentially destabilizing action.
All right. Now, you mentioned the Civil War and the disinformation. Mm-hmm. Most of that came, you've got an illiterate population, and the way to disseminate disinformation was at the pulpit every Sunday. Now, more people can, well, our president can't, but more people can read in our society, or hell, they have a cell phone and they can get misinformation there, Facebook, what have you. Is that an accelerant nowadays? Facebook and Fox News?
Well, I think that the real impact of this sort of social media is not necessarily the spreading of information itself, but being able to more closely tailor or hone the message to particularly receptive audiences. Mm-hmm. Traditional broadcast media like television, even like newspapers and movies and things like that, that's essentially an informational shotgun. You take it and you put it out there, and then everyone's going to see it. And if you're putting out a particularly ugly message, people are not going to receive it well. There are some people who will receive it.
Dude, I've made some really ugly movies, and they've made the most money of all of them.
Yeah, but So yeah, well, I'm more talking about the ideology that's underlying them. If you're trying to put out an ugly idea, some people will be receptive to it. Some people will organize and resist it,
Uh-huh.
or protest it, or whatever. One thing that social media lets you do is go under the radar and only let the people who are going to be receptive to it see it, and not let the people who get riled up about it see it nearly as easily
Mm-hmm.
through targeted advertising or by creating little corners of the internet where only people who think like you go. So I think that the real risk here when it comes to misinformation in the social media age isn't the existence of misinformation itself, but rather the ability to silo it so that it's not really challenged by people from opposing viewpoints, or that it's easy to go into your corner and not really encounter these conflicting points of view.
Hmm. Have you ever been to the Midwest or the South?
I'm a Hoosier by birth.
Pardon?
So I grew up in Indiana. I'm a Hoosier by birth, so I grew up in Indiana.
Oh, okay. Do you visit? Have you returned?
Yeah.
Oh,
I've not been back for a couple years, but before I graduated from the University of Notre Dame in 2014. I
oh,
lived
wow.
in Oklahoma for 2 years, and now I'm here in Seattle. And I've been here for 3 years.
Fish out of water. Um, but if you go to an airport waiting area, a bar, a McDonald's, any place where there's a TV, and they have the news going on, uniformly, it's Fox. It's a constant. It's part of the atmosphere. Um, they're certainly trying to reach a broader audience as opposed to laser beaming a message, and it seems to be pervasive and working.
Right. Well, I mean, that's what I mean. Even to that extent, though, cable news audiences are a shadow of what broadcast audiences were in the 50s or 60s, certainly, but even today. Fox News viewership is much smaller than viewership for, say, the NBC News with Lester Holt.
Mm-hmm.
Lester Holt has more eyeballs than any of the people on Fox. So even though it's still being shotgunned out there a little bit, most people who are tuning into it are people who want that story being told to them in the first place.
Okay. That's their church of choice, if you will.
Yeah, but that's not what I would point to as like the under the radar thing. That the under the radar thing is really more what you find on the corners of Twitter or on various corners of the internet, where you don't often find a lot of liberals going to read Breitbart or the Drudge Report, and you don't find a lot of conservatives wandering over to read or to watch MSNBC perhaps, or to read Daily Kos or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So you're creating informational silos where pushback to stories aren't occurring, and then people don't even know, in many senses, what the big stories are on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
They're not even necessarily aware of the issues that they're getting outraged by. So when people are getting angry about something, it might seem entirely out of the blue if you haven't been following what the other side is following.
Definitely an isolationist via media, isolationism via the media. Oh man, I could go on, but we've hit the hour here, Patrick, and I've usurped your time and time away from those good students. Are you going to give them all A's?
No.
All right. Well, thank you, sir. And I'm going to pass on the thanks to Paul Jupe for referring you. Is there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I would say that lots of societies go through steps towards collapse, but will like halt or be able to catch themselves before they go totally flat to the face. And in the end, it really depends on people actively pulling together and working in a concerted effort to address the emerging problems in order to prevent the stumble. And if you fall flat on your face, it doesn't mean you're necessarily gone forever. You can look at the example of China. China fell on its face in the 19th century. It stumbled around throughout most of the 20th century, hurting itself more, in many cases with like the Cultural Revolution and stuff like that, but has refound its footing and is reemerging as a society.
Japan.
Yeah, Japan is another example, or even Europe after World War II. So collapses don't necessarily mean the end, but sometimes they do. And being able to identify what the real threat is an important thing, an important part of a government being able to guide its nation, guide its people through a potential collapse threat and help them get to the other side of the threat. And so a real issue that we're going to have to see play out in the government over the next 5, 10, 15 years is whether or not it's going to be able to build a new coalition that's going to be able to address major threats, or if we're going to get drawn into ever deeper internal conflict. And the sewing together or ripping apart, I think, is really going to be the story of our political, the political story of our nation over the next decade.
Well said, young man. Well said. Definitely optimistic, and I hope you're right. I'm 62 years old, though, so I don't think I have time to see it. But you carry on, okay?
I'll do what I can.
All right, Patrick. Have a good one, and thank you for the interview.